On a morning in 217 BC, a Roman consular army was advancing along the northern shore of Lake Trasimene. The men at the front had already moved deep into the lakeside passage. The center of the column still stretched along the narrow road. The rear was only beginning to pass through the entrance. They believed Hannibal was somewhere ahead. Through the morning mist, the Roman vanguard could make out Carthaginian heavy infantry in the distance. It was a clear target, and it looked like the beginning of a conventional battle. Beyond that, they could see almost nothing. The front did not know what was happening behind it. The rear did not know why the men ahead were beginning to slow. No one could see the Roman army as a whole. Still, the column continued forward. With every step, it moved farther from open ground. With every unit that entered, the road behind became more crowded. The Roman army was still intact. Its soldiers carried their weapons. Its standards were still among the ranks. Its officers remained at their posts. They had not yet been defeated, but they were beginning to lose three things: the space to turn, the time to deploy, and the ability to fight together as one army. What followed would become one of the largest and most complete ambushes recorded in ancient warfare. Hannibal was waiting. The signal had not yet been given, and the trap did not truly begin beside the lake. It began months earlier, in a flooded wilderness. The Romans believed no army could cross. After defeating a Roman army at the river Trebia, Hannibal appeared to hold the initiative. But that victory had not solved his most dangerous problem. Many of the Gallic allies in his army wanted Roman power driven out of their homeland. They had not joined Hannibal so the war could remain in northern Italy forever. They expected him to continue south and carry the destruction into territory controlled by Rome. The longer he stayed, the more food, land, and lives the Gauls would lose. Their patience was not unlimited. Rome also reacted quickly. Two newly elected consuls took command of separate armies and watched the main routes Hannibal might use to enter central Italy. Those roads were not completely sealed. But if Hannibal followed any conventional route, his movements would be easier to detect, and the two Roman armies might draw closer together and trap him between them. So Hannibal chose a path the Romans saw no reason to defend: the flooded marshes near the river Arno. According to the ancient accounts, his army struggled through water, mud, and unstable ground for 4 days and 3 nights. At times the road disappeared completely. Pack animals sank into the mire. Soldiers could find no dry ground on which to rest and slept briefly against baggage or the bodies of fallen animals. This was not a maneuver without cost. The army lost men, animals, and strength. An infection in one of Hannibal's eyes worsened during the crossing, and he eventually lost the sight in it. But the suffering brought him the one thing he needed most: surprise. When the army finally emerged from the marshes, Hannibal had entered Etruria from a direction the Romans had not expected. He had passed beyond Flaminius and appeared behind the Roman defensive position. Yet Hannibal still did not attack, because he did not merely need to find a Roman army. He needed to make that army move according to his design. The man standing between Hannibal and the Roman heartland was the consul Gaius Flaminius. He was not a commander who can be reduced to a single word like reckless. Flaminius drew much of his political strength from the Roman people. He had supported the distribution of land taken from the Gauls to Roman citizens, and he had built military prestige in campaigns against Gallic tribes. Those achievements won him broad popular support. They also placed him in long-running conflict with the conservative traditions, defended by much of the Roman Senate. Later ancient writers, especially those hostile to his politics, often described him as impatient, arrogant, and contemptuous of tradition. For Hannibal, however, the important question was not whether those judgments were entirely fair. The important question was how Flaminius would act under pressure. Hannibal sent cavalry to study the roads, food supplies, and movements of the Roman army. He also gathered information about the commander facing him. He judged that Flaminius would find it difficult to remain inactive while Italian land was being destroyed. If the consul stayed in camp, his army would be safer, but Rome's allies would continue to suffer. If he waited for the other consul, Servilius, the military situation might improve. but Flaminius would lose the initiative, and perhaps the political credit for an independent victory. If he pursued immediately, he could answer the expectations of Rome's allies and citizens, but he would also begin moving according to Hannibal's timetable. Hannibal no longer saw the Roman army as an ordinary target, waiting to be defeated. He began constructing a situation around one specific commander, a situation in which every form of delay carried a visible cost. Now he had to test his judgment. Hannibal passed near Flaminius without turning back to challenge him. He continued into the richer districts of Etruria. Farms, grain stores, and settlements along his route were destroyed. The losses did not fall only on Roman citizens, they also struck the Italian communities allied to Rome. From a purely military perspective, Flaminius could still wait. But every day of waiting made the situation harder to accept. Hannibal's army was moving freely through Roman-controlled territory while the consul responsible for defending the region remained in camp. And Hannibal showed no urgency to fight. He simply continued south. It was as though the Roman army behind him was not important enough to stop for. This was more than a provocation. It placed Flaminius before three choices, none of them good. He could remain in position and preserve his army, but he could not stop allied land from being destroyed. He could wait for Servilius and gain strength, but Hannibal would move farther south, and the campaign would no longer be his to control alone. Or he could pursue immediately, answer the demands of Rome's allies, and recover the initiative. But that meant abandoning his current position and entering a rhythm set by Hannibal. Flaminius chose to move. His army left camp and followed the route of the Carthaginians toward the south. That decision did not prove that Hannibal understood his opponent perfectly, but it confirmed the most important part of his calculation. The Romans believed they were pursuing an enemy who refused to fight. In reality, Hannibal had already begun deciding where they would finally catch him. The northern shore of Lake Trasimene was not a place where an entire army could simply vanish. Hannibal did not try to hide every soldier. What he needed to control was what the Romans could see, and what they would fail to notice because of it. On one side of the lakeside road lay the water. On the other, the ground rose into slopes and higher ridges. The road was wide enough for an army to march along it, but not wide enough for a large Roman force to shift quickly from a column into a full battle formation. When the Roman vanguard looked ahead, it could see a Carthaginian position in the distance, along with part of Hannibal's Iberian and African heavy infantry. Those troops formed a clear and understandable target. The Romans would assume that the enemy was in front of them. If they kept advancing, they would eventually reach Hannibal's main force. The soldiers who would decide the ambush remained outside Roman sight. Light infantry used uneven ground and the cover of the heights to conceal themselves. Gallic troops occupied positions along the flanks. Cavalry waited where it could threaten the entrance and the road back. The ancient sources do not agree on the exact placement of every unit, but the functions of those forces are clear. The visible infantry ahead drew the Roman vanguard forward. The concealed troops were positioned to strike from the sides. The cavalry would make it difficult for the column to retreat along the road it had entered. The lake closed one direction, the slopes restricted the other, and the visible enemy ahead kept pulling Roman attention deeper into the passage. The road appeared to lead toward Hannibal. In reality, it was compressing the Roman army into a column that grew longer with every step and harder to turn with every moment. By the time Flaminius approached the lake, Hannibal's deployment was largely complete. The troops meant to be seen remained visible ahead. The soldiers hidden on the heights and along the flanks had to remain quiet. Hannibal could not attack as soon as the first Roman units appeared. If he moved too early, much of the Roman army might stop outside the trap. He had to wait. The Romans still had options. They could halt and reassess the enemy's position. They could send more men to examine the road ahead and the higher ground beside it. They could also wait for Servilius to draw closer, but reconnaissance would slow the pursuit. Waiting would allow Hannibal to move farther away. To an army already chasing an enemy, the Carthaginians seemed close. Every pause risked losing them again. Later Roman writers placed a series of ominous signs around this final advance. A horse stumbled. A standard could not easily be pulled from the ground. sacred chickens refused to eat. These stories tell us more about how Romans later explained disaster than about any supernatural force determining the outcome. The warning that mattered militarily was far more ordinary. The Roman army did not conduct a thorough reconnaissance of the road ahead, or the heights beside it. The Romans were not without choices, but under the pressure of pursuit, every small decision that appeared reasonable made it harder to stop and reconsider. At dawn, the first Roman soldiers entered the lakeside passage. The rest of the army followed. At first, the Roman army was simply marching. The vanguard passed through the entrance and continued along the road beside the lake. The center and rear followed behind. The retreat route had not yet been physically sealed by Carthaginian cavalry, but as more soldiers entered, the road behind became crowded. Any sudden halt or attempt to turn back would now collide with units still advancing from the rear. Then the vanguard saw the Carthaginian heavy infantry ahead. Within their limited field of vision, that was the only clear threat. The Roman soldiers had no reason to focus on slopes they could not see. The enemy they could identify was in front of them, so the column kept moving forward. And as it moved, the army stretched farther apart. The vanguard, center, and rear entered different spaces. The morning mist made that separation worse. The men at the front could not see what was happening near the entrance. The men at the rear could not understand why the column was slowing. Most officers could control only the soldiers immediately around them. The army still had numbers, equipment, and training, but it was becoming unable to halt as one body, turn as one body, or deploy into a battle line before it was too late. Hannibal could not know the exact position of every Roman unit in the column. He did not need to. He needed to know only one thing: enough of the Roman army was inside. Then the signal was given. The Roman vanguard expected the battle to begin in front of it, and it did encounter the Iberian and African heavy infantry ahead, but those troops were not a target waiting to be broken. They became a barrier, blocking the road at the moment the Roman column most needed to keep moving. Almost at once, attacks came from other directions. The troops hidden on the slopes and flanks descended toward the lakeside road. Cavalry threatened the entrance and the rear, denying the last units freedom to withdraw. The first problem facing the Romans was not whether their soldiers were willing to fight. It was that no one could see the battle as a whole. The vanguard did not know that the rear was already under attack. The rear did not know why the front had stopped. The soldiers in the center could see only the confusion around them and the nearest enemy. A centurion might command the men close enough to hear him, but he could not coordinate with units farther along the congested column. Senior officers could not read the full battlefield. There was no full battlefield to read. No coherent Roman battle line had formed. Under normal conditions, standards so chose where their units were and gave them a point around which to regroup. But in the mist, the crowding and attacks arriving from several directions, many men could not even tell where they were supposed to gather. Roman training did not suddenly disappear. Roman courage did not vanish in a single moment. What disappeared were the conditions that allowed training and courage to matter. Without a shared view, the army could not understand the larger situation. Without unified command, separate units could not act together. Without space, the marching column could not deploy. Without time, organized legions were reduced to countless improvised groups, each responding to the nearest threat. At the front, some men were still trying to break through. At the rear, others were already searching for a way back. In the center, soldiers were being attacked from the slopes and the sides at the same time. There was resistance everywhere, but resistance in one part of the column could not support another. The courage of one century could not reconnect an army already divided by terrain, fog, distance, and enemy pressure. Hannibal did not first destroy the Roman soldiers. He destroyed the conditions that allowed those soldiers to fight as one army. From that moment, there was no longer a single battle beside Lake Trasimene. There were only isolated struggles, cut off from one another. The Roman soldiers around Flaminius continued to resist. Ancient accounts suggest that some of the fiercest fighting took place near the consul himself. He tried to maintain order among the troops close to him, but he could no longer influence the wider column. Eventually, Flaminius was killed by Gallic warriors. His death did not suddenly collapse the entire Roman army, as though a single command had been removed. The army had already lost contact with itself, but for the soldiers still gathering around the consul, the last recognizable center of command was now gone. Elsewhere, the fighting forced increasing numbers of Romans toward the lake. The water had begun as a boundary. It now became an obstacle with no easy crossing. Heavy equipment, crowding, enemy pursuit, and confusion left many of those who entered the water unable to move effectively. Odding group of roughly 6,000 Roman soldiers from the front of the column succeeded in breaking through the Carthaginian force ahead. They continued onward, at first unaware of what had happened to the main army behind them. Only after reaching higher ground, where their view opened, did they understand that the fighting along the lakeshore was nearly over. They were in no position to return. The group withdrew to a nearby settlement. The following day, forces led by Hannibal surrounded them, and they surrendered. Livy and other ancient writers preserve one especially striking detail. During the battle, they claimed, an earthquake shook parts of Italy, yet the men fighting beside the lake did not notice it. The account cannot give us a precise reconstruction of the scene, but it captures what the ancient historians wanted their readers to understand. The battle had consumed everything the soldiers were capable of perceiving. According to Livy, the fighting lasted for about 3 hours. Roughly 15,000 Romans were killed. Ancient estimates of Hannibal's losses vary, generally falling between 1,500 and 2,500 men, with the Gallic troops suffering heavily. After the battle, Hannibal reportedly ordered a search for Flaminius's body so that it could be buried. It was never found. The consular army that had entered the lakeside road that morning no longer existed as an effective field force by the time the fighting ended. But Hannibal's use of the victory did not stop with the battle. After the fighting, the prisoners were separated. Roman citizens remained in captivity. Soldiers from Rome's Italian allied communities were released without ransom. This was a deliberate political act. Hannibal wanted the cities of Italy to understand that he claimed to be fighting Roman domination, not every people living on the peninsula. The releases did not immediately destroy Rome's alliance system, but they planted a dangerous question in communities across Italy. Was continuing to fight for Rome still the only possible choice? The captured equipment was also put to use. In time, some of Hannibal's African heavy infantry were rearmed with Roman weapons and armor. The victory had not only weakened the enemy, it had begun to change the equipment and fighting methods of Hannibal's own army. Meanwhile, another Roman force was approaching. Servilius had sent roughly 4,000 cavalry ahead, hoping to make contact with Flaminius. Before they fully understood what had happened beside the lake, they were intercepted by forces led by Hannibal. About half were killed in the fighting. The rest were forced to surrender. The shock of Lake Trasimene did not end when the first ambush was over. One consular army had been destroyed. The cavalry sent to reinforce it had disappeared soon afterward. When the news reached Rome, it caused severe panic. That did not mean Rome had lost the ability to continue the war, nor did it mean Hannibal could simply march through the gates of the city without resistance. But the Romans had to recognize that their previous way of fighting was failing. Each year, consuls had taken separate armies into the field, sought a decisive encounter, and tried to solve the problem of Hannibal through one direct victory. That approach had now imposed a devastating cost. Rome responded by appointing Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator. The new strategy did not rush to accept the kind of decisive battle Hannibal wanted. Instead, it emphasized shadowing his movements, avoiding direct engagement, delaying his operations, and wearing down his army over time. This was one of the deepest consequences of Lake Trasimene. Hannibal had not merely destroyed a Roman army, he had forced Rome to change the way it confronted him, and the battle became one of the largest and most complete ambushes of the ancient world, not simply because Hannibal found terrain suited to concealment. The battle had begun before either army reached the lake. First, he accepted the risks of the marsh crossing and moved beyond the routes Rome was watching. Then he studied his opponent's position and used destruction to create political and military pressure. He placed Flaminius before a series of choices that all carried real costs. He used the visible enemy ahead to draw Roman attention in one direction, then selected ground that divided vision, command, and freedom of movement. Flaminius did not act without reason. He faced devastated allied territory, an enemy moving farther south, political expectations, and information that was never complete. Hannibal's advantage was that much of this pressure had been created by Hannibal himself. What was destroyed beside Lake Trasimene was not only an army of tens of thousands of men, it was the network of connections that allowed an army to exist. When soldiers could no longer see one another, officers could no longer pass orders, and units could no longer find space to deploy, training and courage survived only in isolated pockets. The Romans were not defeated along one continuous battle line. They were destroyed section by section, after they had lost the ability to become a single army again. That is the true reason the ambush at Lake Trasimene has remained so memorable. It showed that an army can still have brave soldiers, weapons in hand, and officers in position, and yet lose the conditions required for victory before the battle has even properly begun.